Good morning and good evening, everyone. I'm Ioanna Kakouli, the Acting Director of the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture and Professor at UCLA. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to today's lecture, Love's Labor and the Angelic Beloved, Voices from Cypriot Renaissance Poetry, presented by Professor Irene Papadaki from the University of Cyprus. As we gather here to celebrate National Poetry Month, we embark on a journey to explore not only the poetic treasures of Cyprus, but also its rich heritage. Dr. Papadaki will serve as our guide, leading us through the captivating world of Cypriot Renaissance poetry. Today's lecture, supported by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, is held under the auspices of the Deputy Ministry of Culture of the Republic of Cyprus, the Embassy of Greece in the United States, the Embassy of the Republic of Cyprus to the United States, the Consulate General of Greece in Los Angeles, and the Honorary Consul General of Cyprus in Los Angeles. This event, organized by the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center, is co-sponsored with the UCLA CMRS Center for Early Global Studies, the UCLA Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, and underscores our dedication to promoting awareness of Hellenic culture on a global stage. We extend our sincere gratitude to each of these organizations for their generous support. Reflecting on the rich history of Cyprus, situated in the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, one cannot help but marvel at its resilience and adaptability. Millennia of diverse influences, from the ancient Greeks to Romans to the Byzantines, Latins, and Ottomans, have shaped Cyprus into the cultural gem it is today. However, it is the turbulent history of Cyprus, from the Crusades to the Ottoman conquest and beyond, which serves as a backdrop to the cultural flourishing that we explore today. Today's lecture will shine a spotlight on Rimes Agapis, Rhymes of Love, an anonymous collection of poems that stands as a testament to the artistic brilliance of the Greek Renaissance. Preserved in a single manuscript at the Marciana Library in Venice, these poems offer a unique glimpse into the richness of Cyprus' heritage during this period. Additionally, we are privileged to feature poetry readings by the acclaimed singer-songwriter Alkinos Ioannidis, adding a special dimension to our exploration. As we embark on this intellectual journey, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Simon Zenios, the Associate Director of our Center, who will have the honor of introducing our esteemed speaker, Professor Irene Papadaki. Thank you and welcome once again to today's enlightening lecture.
Thank you, Ioanna. It is a great pleasure to welcome everyone to today's event as well. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I would briefly like to say that our annual lecture on the occasion of National Poetry Month, which we began with the Embassy of Greece in the United States, and we thank them for their continued support, gives us the opportunity to host distinguished speakers that guide us in celebrating, but also reflecting on important authors and foundational works of Greek literature. The word foundational should be doubly underlined today. The group of poems from Renaissance Cyprus that have come to be broadly known as Rimes Agapis, Rhymes of Love, represent the most masterful and comprehensive introduction of Western lyric forms in Greek literature. They are also a monument of the most accomplished use of the local vernacular, Cypriot Greek, as a literary language. Their importance, though, is not only historical or scholarly. They inspire even today authors, singers, and composers who engage with them in creative dialogue. We are fortunate that Professor Irene Papadaki, a distinguished scholar of early modern Greek and Cypriot culture and literature, will be our guide today, and also that Alkinos Ioannidis, the beloved singer-songwriter, will lend his voice to the words of Renaissance Cyprus, his homeland. Before I present our speaker, I would like to share with you two sets of opening remarks sent by Her Excellency Ekaterini Nassika, the Ambassador of Greece to the United States, and His Excellency Evangelos Savas, the Ambassador of the Republic of Cyprus to the United States.
Once again, the Embassy of Greece is delighted to extend its support to the commendable efforts of the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture. I send my warm regards and best wishes to the organizers, participants, and viewers of this engaging initiative, which delves into the Cypriot Renaissance love poetry. Like every person, I have my flaws. Today, I'll admit to one. I've always loved poetry, even as a young girl. Even now, I make time for poetry in my life. So you imagine my joy when I came upon the wonderfully titled lecture by Professor Irene Papadaki at the University of Cyprus. Getting to write about poetry felt like a breath of fresh air when compared to my usual writing material. Additionally, this lecture is presented as a part of the National Poetry Month established by the Academy of American Poets and celebrated across the United States. I have the misfortune of finding myself stranded in Washington without my books, and unfortunately my expertise on Cypriot Renaissance poetry is indeed very limited. And yet, I will very briefly share some thoughts with you. Cypriot literature is a child of the Greek language, which has never ceased to be spoken and written. The encounter of our language with the literature of the Renaissance, especially in the Italian lands, and notably in Venice, and later on in the Venetian-held Crete and Ionian Islands, and texts, played a crucial role in the revival of Europe's interest in classical culture. Which is why, when I read that the collection of Cypriot love poems is preserved in a unique manuscript of the Marciana Library in Venice, I couldn't help but to feel moved. This great library was established in 1468 when Bessarion, a Byzantine Greek Renaissance humanist, theologian, and Catholic cardinal, presented his very extensive collection of about 500 Greek manuscripts to the Senate of the Republic of Venice, thus forming the nucleus of Marciana. Cyprus has been a hub of Greek culture for thousands of years. In contemporary times, Cypriot poets such as Kostas Montis and Kyriakos Charalambidis have made significant contributions to our literary traditions. In addition, many Greek poets, above all our Nobel laureate George Seferis, have drawn inspiration from Cyprus' history, cultural heritage, and landscape. Like, for instance, in the 15th century, a recital concerning the sweet island of Cyprus entitled Chronicle by Leontios Macheras, I presume in a period close to our Renaissance love poems. I would like to finish by sharing some of my favorite lines in Greek from a masterpiece of the Cretan Renaissance. These lines are obviously from Erotokritos, an epic poem by Vicenzos Kornaros, who died in 1613, just before his contemporaries Shakespeare and Cervantes. And I quote, «Εφάνει ολόχαρη η αυγή και τη δροσούλα ρίχνει, σημάδια τσικεσεφάντωσης κοινή την ώρα δείχνει. Χορτάρια ευγήκαν εις την γην, τα δεντρουλάκια ανθίσα, και από τσαγκάλες του ουρανού γλυκής βοράς εφίσα». Thank you for your time and enjoy the presentation by Professor Papadakis.
Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to address a few remarks on the occasion of your event on Cypriot Renaissance poetry. Cyprus's literary history, as is well known, is quite rich. In antiquity, one recalls the epic poem Cypria, while during the Middle Ages, Byzantine epic poetry flourished, notably in the form of the so-called acritic songs. Given Cyprus's complex history and intermingling of different cultural influences, primarily due to its unique location, a connection developed over time linking East and West. This very connection is very aptly reflected in the Renaissance poetry of Cyprus, which is written in Cypriot dialect while influenced by Italian Renaissance poetry. As a matter of fact, the resulting poetry in this regard constitutes the first Renaissance poems in the Greek language. With love being the driving, preeminent inspiration of the poets of the time, their work references everyday life on the island during this particular historical period, documenting the societal, cultural, and musical norms of Venetian Cyprus. As such, they are an integral component of Cyprus's tangible as well as intangible cultural heritage. Today's event is yet another wonderful opportunity to inform the American public of the cultural heritage of Cyprus and Hellenism in a more general sense. I wish therefore to express and underline once again warm congratulations to the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture for organizing this event, which is part of a series organized in collaboration with our embassy. My appreciation and gratitude also goes out to Irene Papadakis and Alkinos Ioannidis for their valuable contributions today. Thank you.
We will now proceed to the main part of the event. It gives me great and distinct pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Irene Papadaki, who is Professor of Modern Greek Literature at the Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Cyprus. Professor Papadaki received her PhD from the University of Crete, and she was previously a research fellow at the Greek Institute of Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies in Venice. Professor Papadaki has published widely on several aspects of early modern Greek culture and literature. I highlight her several publications on the history of the book and her two book-length editions of important sources, Johannes Dono, Notary of Handaka, and The Art of Counting in Cyprus During the 17th Century, The Practical Arithmetic of Petros Roussos. Her articles on Neoplatonism in early modern literature and culture, including on the set of poems we will be discussing today, have become foundational in the field. She has also participated in numerous research projects of such institutions as the Greek Institute in Venice, the Piraeus Bank Group Cultural Foundation, the Silvia Ioannou Foundation, the Leventis Foundation, and the University of Cyprus. I highlight also that she has led two research projects which are directly relevant to our topic: comparative approaches between early modern Greek and Italian literature, and the Circle of Giandomenico Martoretta. The title of Professor Papadaki's talk today is Love's Labor and the Angelic Beloved, Voices from Cypriot Renaissance Poetry. Please join me in welcoming Professor Papadaki, who has the floor now.
I would like to thank wholeheartedly my dear colleagues Simos Zenios and Ioanna Kakouli, and through them the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture, for organizing today's event and for inviting me to present a research subject that has been of particular interest to me in recent years. I am delighted to be able to share with you some of the lyrical voices of Cypriot Renaissance poetry, which we often study with my students at the University of Cyprus. I'm also glad that we will have the opportunity to listen to these voices through readings of the outstanding Cypriot singer and songwriter Alkinos Ioannidis. These readings will be screened at various moments of my presentation, By clicking the link provided in the chat, you will find the original Cypriot poems that will be read, along with English translations. Please allow me a few moments to upload the PowerPoint I have prepared for our meeting. In the collective imagination of European intellectuals during the Renaissance, as perhaps in our own days, Cyprus appeared as the island of Aphrodite. In a Neoplatonic treatise on the magic of love in 1591, the Italian scholar Guido Casoni maintained that in order to be initiated into the amorous mysteries, one should travel to the island, visit the temple of Eros, and be taught by the god himself the stages that would lead him from simple erotic desire for a beautiful body to the contemplation of the beautiful itself, which, as we already know from Plato's Symposium, constituted the ultimate step of the ladder of love. But how did Cypriots themselves express desire in their lyric poetry during the Renaissance? There is a valuable testimony at our disposal. It is a poetic collection that survives today in a manuscript at the Marciana Library in Venice, as we already heard. I remind you that from 1489 to 1571, Cyprus was under Venetian rule. During this period, many factors contributed to the gradual integration of Cyprus into the Venetian state fabric. First, the versatile Venetian policy of incorporation of populations with linguistic, religious, and cultural differences into a hierarchically structured, unified social system. To this, we must add the widening of opportunities for social advancement, the organization of a flexible mechanism of governance and control over transgressions, even those of high officials. We should also add the acknowledgement of the rights of different social groupings and the cultivation of a sense of trust of the citizen towards the state. The creation of new economic opportunities through the practice of artisanal, commercial, and naval professions, the expansion of Cypriot trade into international networks throughout the Mediterranean, and the monetization of the economy also enhanced ties with the metropolis. This is worth noting given the fact that the distance between the island and Venice was almost 1,500 nautical miles. Doctrinal differences did not create an unbridged gap between the Catholic and Orthodox communities in the island, since over time religious identity became less strong in comparison to the political identity of the citizen of the Venetian state. The alignment of Cypriot cultural reality with the corresponding Italian one was also manifested by frequent travels of Cypriots to the Venetian capital for commercial and educational purposes. Many natives sought the opportunity to study at the University of Padua or other Italian universities. From this perspective, it is not surprising that, as we shall see, the precious collection of Cypriot love poems reflects the approach of the different cultural components present in the island, and that the manuscript in which this poetic collection was contained ended up in Venice in the private library of a notable scholar of the 16th century, Natale Conte. We do not know if the Cypriot love poems under consideration are the work of one or of several poets, nor whether these poets partially or entirely composed them in or outside Cyprus. The connection with the island arises primarily from the Cypriot dialect in which they are written. In one of the poems, Kitty is referred to as the cradle of the lyrical subject. Kitty, you have been a cradle for me, an Eden of discerning beauty. In some other poems, he declares that he struggled with desire while on the island and distanced himself from it to quench the fire that burned within him, but also to serve the homeland. The place he ended up in is not specified, He only mentions that he came from the east to the west. However, his heart remained behind, close to his ideal beloved. Let's watch now Alkinos Ioannidis reading a poem that expresses this exact notion. It is the poem number 22 in the file with the translations attached to the chat window on page 6.
Κοντεύγει η ώρα κι ο καιρός, κυρά μου, που μέλει να μισέψω από ξαυτός σου. Όμως αφήνω δα, στον ορισμό σου, όλων των εμαυτών μου, αγγέλισσά μου. Μη δε απορείς, αν εμπορώ, Θεά μου, μισεύγοντα να αφήσω εμέν σ' αυτός σου. Μισεύγω, αμώ που πάγω, γιον δικός σου, μένουσιν μετασέν τα πνεύματά μου. Πάγω, κι αν ένωσες ποτέ σε σέναν πάθος αγάπης, βλέπε την καρδιά μου, πας και το σώμαν ποιον δεν σε βιγλίσει. Αν μπει κανένας κι άλλην παρασέναν αγάπησα ποτέ, πέαχ τη μεριά μου, με δίχως την καρδιά, πώς να αγαπήσει.
Ancient myths fuel the inspiration of the poet or the poets throughout the collection. In some of them, the lyrical subject is paralleled with the ancient god Apollo, who seeks union with the nymph Daphne. This is a union that remains unattainable, as the pursued nymph is transformed by the gods into the eponymous plant, Daphne, the laurel, to remain untouched. The transformational moment is captured in Bernini's famous sculpture you see here. In other poems, the lover is paralleled with Icarus, who, with his waxen wings, ascends to the heavens, the realm of the angelic beloved. Yet there the wax melts, and the lover is lost in the depths of the abyss. In the introductory poem of the collection, the poet's heart is likened to a lion gazing at the top of a tree and preparing to leap high. We will hear the reading of the poem once again by Alkinos Ioannidis. It is poem number 1 on page number 2.
Διασημάδιν έχω λιόντα, στην οχράν οπούν γιονάστρον. Πράσινων δεντρών σαν κάστρον πάντα στέκεται θωρώντα. Μόρεξιν παντές βιγλώντα του δεντρού τους κλόνους χάσκει, να πηδήσει πάνω πάσκει, και γι' αυτόν στέκει στεκόντα. Η καρδιά μου με τον λιόντα τούτον εμπορεί να μοιάσει, από του δεντρού να πιάσει την κορφήν πάσκει πηδώντα. Η καρδιά μου πεθυμώντα στα ψηλά θέλει να πετάσει, και μη δίνοντα να φτάσει, στέκει χαμηλά κλαμώντα.
So the heart is getting ready to soar high, and yet no matter how great the effort, the desire remains unfulfilled. Who will hear the lament of the lyrical subject? Who will share his pain? The ideal listener, the one who sympathizes with him, is none other than the nightingale. For indeed, the nightingale is not a simple bird. According to ancient Greek mythology, it used to be a person, the Athenian Procne, whom her husband Tyreus betrayed by raping her sister Philomela. To avenge this altercation, Procne murdered their son Itys, boiled his corpse, and served it to Tyreus. She was consequently transformed into the nightingale in order to mourn her gruesome fate in the ages to come. The birdsong corresponds to the lament of the lyrical subject in the poem numbered 24. on page 8. Let's listen to the registration.
Τα δόνην τσίνων που γλυκιά θλιβάτε, τόσον λυπητικά, τόσον καμένα, να πεις δεν έχει τέριν, γιον και μέναν, για ταύτου προς εμέν παραπονάτε. Τόσο γλυκιά την λύπην του μετράτε και πολεμά να στέκομαι νοιασμένα τα κλάματά του που είναι λυπημένα, απου τα πια γνωρίζω πως φυράτε. Μόνον τζίνε πουλήν, παντές λυπάτε τα πάθη μου και εκείνον και θρηνίζει και αφών με τόσην πλήξην μα γνωρίζει, τα γκώματά του ξάφτου μου ξηγάτε. Μέραν δε νύχτα δε μου ξικολλάτε, ούδανταν να πετάσει ξομακρίζει. Το κλάμαν, αν μου λώσω, μα θυμίζει, κι ούλη νύχτα μητά μου δεν κοιμάται. Πιστεύω πόθος το πέψεν σ' αυτό μου, δια να μη δεν σιγήσει το λαμπρό μου.
The unfulfilled desire in Cypriot poetry is sensed by birds, animals, plants. It is reflected throughout creation, acquiring cosmic dimensions. As impressive as these notions may sound, you may feel that they are not entirely original. You've probably heard them before somewhere. The idealized love that so moved the great poets of the late 19th and 20th centuries, such as Pound and Eliot, permeates Western civilization steadily and dates back at least to the troubadours, the poets who in the late Middle Ages, between the late 11th and the 14th centuries, first spoke in a language close to everyday speech, about emotions flooding the lyrical self for a lady who remained unattainable. That lady, socially superior to the troubadour who praised her, would at best accept the lover's devotion, much as a ruler accepts the loyalty of his subjects. When troubadour poetry spread from southern France to the Italian peninsula, first in Sicily and then to Tuscany, the desire of the lyrical subject turned to a woman who was no longer superior socially, but morally, ultimately culminating in the idealized form of the angelic woman in the poetry of Dante and Petrarch. The latter, Petrarch, in the collection Rerum Vulgarium Fragmenta, translated as Fragments in the Vernacular, narrated the insatiable desire for the beloved Laura, an unfulfilled longing, like that of Apollo for Daphne, which nevertheless constituted an exercise in virtue. And when Laura died, he continued his poetic writing, extolling her as an angel who had returned to the heavenly realm from which he had come. Petrarch lived in the 14th century. His poetry was well received by his contemporary and later poets. A century later, it had begun to emerge as a model of lyrical writing, so powerful that it gained followers and imitators throughout Europe. It is no coincidence that from at least the late 15th century to the mid-16th century, handwritten and later printed collections of lyrical poetry recounted the same basic approach. A love whose Neoplatonic hue became increasingly sensible, so much so that it constituted a primary path for a transcendent experience. In this context, it is not surprising that a significant portion of the poems in the Cypriot collection are translations, more or less freely, of Italian Petrarchan poems. Sometimes the Italian models are not translated literally, but they lend ideas, images, or symbols to the Cypriot ones. Comparative analysis between the compositions of the Cypriot collection and their Italian counterparts have shown that the Cypriot poet or poets understand to a large extent, if not fully, not only the meaning of the Italian poems, but also the cultural and philosophical framework from which they draw inspiration. For example, let's listen to the poem numbered 8 from the Cypriot collection, which translates a composition by the famous Venetian humanist Pietro Bembo. You can find it on page number 4.
Τούταν τα γλυκιά μάτια που βιγλώντα όλος έχασα εγώ τον εμαυτό μου. Τούταν τα φρύδια πάφτουν το λαμπρό μου και λείπει πάγω δωριανά ζητώντα. Τούτανε τα μαλλιά που περιπλιώντα ποθαίνουν την καρδιάν πάντα σ' αυτό μου. Ω, τυπωμένο δι στον λογισμόν μου που ζω για σεν που μεν ξεχωριστώντα. Στο μέτωπό σου η θέλησεν να πείσει ο πόθος το θρονήν του και να πλώσει στη μια μεριάν το θάρρος με τον άδειν, στην άλλη ζωγραφιά με δίχα χράδι. Γιοντάστρι, όδε και εκεί, τέχνη και φύση, καλός αέρας, χάδιν, νους και γνώση.
I had spent a long time trying to understand exactly what the Cypriot poem and its Italian model meant, how the conceptions of the last two verses, art, nature, beauty, grace, intellect, and knowledge, together, form a colorless painting next to the throne of Cupid, which is represented on the forehead of the angelic beloved. I began to unlock the meaning when I came across a phrase from Plato's Symposium. At the last stage of the erotic experience, says Diotima to Socrates, one sees the beautiful itself, pure, unalloyed, unmixed, not full of human flesh and colors. With this in mind, the poet refers to art and nature as the causes of the beloved's beauty, and her figure and grace as forms of it. He employs the intellect, the ability to raise from the specific to the universal, in order to finally ascend to the knowledge of the absolute truth, the idea of beautiful itself. Other indications of the philosophical basis of the poem are references to the imprint of the image of the beloved in the memory of the lover, which acts like a little candle, as in Plato's Aesthetitus. Furthermore, there is reference to the fragmentation of the ego of the lover, which makes him live separately from himself. Why? Because the soul, according to ancient Orphism, has the ability to leave the body in order to stay close to his beloved. If she could only accept this, if love were mutual, the ultimate mystery would occur. The exchange of the souls of the lovers, the soul of one in the body of the other, thus restoring the original unified nature of man. For, as Aristophanes said in Plato's Symposium, some people originally had two heads, two faces, 4 arms and 4 legs. The hybris they showed towards the gods resulted in their division into incomplete beings, man and woman, as we know them today, who constantly seek to unite with their other half. Changing souls, when love is reciprocal, prevails the following poem, numbered 39, on page 10.
Χόρτασε κι ακανή να με πληγώσεις. Και τόσα δεν επλήγωσες κανέναν, πόθε, ταρκεί σε ποιον να με λαβώσεις. Και τόπον δεν έχω πληγείς ουδέναν. Αν εν και τέλος πάσχεις να μου δώσεις, αδιάφορα κοπιάζεις με τα μέναν. Γιατί να ξεύρεις, τούλοι που ποθούσιν, δίχως καρδιάν, κι άλλος σώμαν ζούσιν.
It is clear that Cypriot poetry, much like the Italian Petrarchan poetry, from which it draws inspiration, is rooted in the philosophical theory of Neoplatonism, which was dominant in the Renaissance. During this very particular era of European culture, the power of human intellect came to the forefront, and scholars turned to antiquity in search of models for private, ethical, and political life. Philosophical reflection flowed into poetry, shaping an art of writing with transcendent dimensions. In Cyprus, which was closely connected to the cultural events of the Italian peninsula due to the Venetian rule, the poetic theory of the Italian Renaissance was also transferred. For this reason, it is not surprising that in one of the Cypriot poems we are examining, there is a clear reference to poetics, described as the science of joy and spiritual contemplation. Cypriot love poems are influenced by the Italian counterparts not only in terms of themes, but also in poetic forms. Sonnets, octaves, sestinas, madrigals, and other poetic forms that characterize the lyric poetry of the Italian Renaissance are introduced into a different language context. This is a particularly challenging experiment, as the hentasyllable, the typical verse of Italian poetry, often proves too restrictive to contain the overflow of emotions expressed in the Cypriot dialect. Some Cypriot poems follow a different path. They combine Petrarchan themes with the more traditional Greek 15-syllable verses. There are even some poems more rooted in the Greek tradition, both by topic and verse. I give you as an example the poem numbered 112 on page numbered 12.
Λαξίδια μου σφαλιστικά και στράτες σιγισμένες, απάχτυπες και μοναχές, απούστε μαθημένες, μέσα στα δάση τα πυκνά, να ακούτε μουλωμένες, πως κλαίγω τες ημέρες μου, τες πάντα λυπημένες. Ίσα και δασερά δεντρά και πυκνοβλαστημένα, σκιός όπου θιώχνεις την πορνήν, νερά μου χρυσταλλένα, πουλιά που στα φτερούδια σας κρέμεστε σιγισμένα, τόσο συχνά στο κλάμα μου κι ακρώνεστε σε μένα. Όρη, βουνά μοναξικά, κάμπη μου μπιστεμένη, χόρτα μου δροσοφύτευτα κι αθή μου μυρισμένη, που θέλησε ο έρωτας κι η τύχη μου θλιμμένη, τόσων καιρών οι δρόμοι μου σ' αυτός σας ναν χαμένοι. Πότε θελείστε ο καιρός, ποχάρος ναν γκρισμένος με εκείνους που τον γκράζουσιν χτους άλλους μισισμένος, που μεν να σβήσει το λαμπρόν στο ποιον είμαι καμένος και μέλετε πολλήν καιρών να ξάφτει μουλωμένος.
What certainly deserves attention in the Cypriot love poetry is not only the appropriation of foreign Italian models, but also the utilization of the Greek lyric tradition in new ways and forms. Often the experiment leads to surprises in verses of 12, 13, or 16 syllables, for example. And while the result may seem successful to us today, there are voices within Cypriot poems that seem to question the value of the whole endeavor. Look at the poem numbered 148 on page 14.
Ανάγνωσε, διαβάτη, αυτήν την ρήμην. μηδέν διαβείς καμώνοντας ελίγην στήμη. Γιατί κι άλλος τάχα άνθρωπος εργάστην, αμέστερα ολοφάνερα ετζενιάστην. Ή της τα ξένα μάχεται και τα δικά τα αφήνει, με τον καιρόν της φάλιας του χολήν και δάκρυα πίνει.
So, what is the advice of the poet to whomever approaches his lyric production? He encourages the reader to study the poem, not to merely browse it, given the fact that someone labored over it, and that someone is not necessarily pleased by the outcome. He admits that he erred because he abandoned his own field in order to experiment with unfamiliar foreign ways. But he feels that he failed, and at this point, the pen stops, inspiration fades. I commenced my lecture today by stating that we don't even know if more than one poet contributed to the collection of the Marciana manuscript. The differences in the style of the poems have been interpreted by some scholars as evidence for the attribution of them to different writers. Other scholars, however, believe that the stylistic differences indicate a single poet writing at different stages of his life. It is certain, though, that whoever the poet or the poets were, they consciously sought to conceal their identity. Here is the first page of the manuscript that preserves the poetic collection. What do you see at the bottom left? There is the word crypsis, concealment. What is being hidden? Most probably the identities of the parties engaged with the poetic creation. A similar commitment to secrecy appears in one of the poems numbered 137. The poem is supposed to function as a letter sent by the author to a person with whom he is connected by fraternal friendship. All the themes addressed in it are merely hinted at or implied, and in the last verses it is clearly stated that the cryptic way of communication is supposed to remain undeciphered even by the officials of state engaged in the secret offices of the Venetian administration. The reasons could be many. I tend to believe, under the light of some evidence that has emerged from recent research, that this cryptic mode resembles the behavior of members of some Italian academies of the late Renaissance in northern Italy, in which a few Cypriot scholars participated. In those academies, the cryptic modes were used for the transmission of ideas that could provoke the negative reaction of the Holy Inquisition. Let us remember that from the mid-16th century onwards, the Catholic Reformation tried to impose strict control of the human conscience, veiling heavily, amongst others, the literature and the arts, in order to harness the population in the establishment of doctrine. Within the framework of the Catholic Reformation, Neoplatonism was also forced to step aside and to follow more hidden paths. Despite the obviously deliberate effort to conceal the identity of the creator or the creators of the collection, an interesting testimony has emerged in recent years about the environment in which the Cypriot love poems were written or at least circulated. It concerns the discovery of a musical score containing one of these poems, along with its Italian prototype, both sung to the same melody. Let's listen to the poem first, read by Alkinos Ioannidis. It is number 41 on page 10.
Ο πόθος εις δυο χείλη κουρελένα, μαργαριτάρια κάπως αφιτεύγει. Δείχνει με τέχνην κι έχει ταχωσμένα, κάθα που θέλει κάποιον να δοξεύγει. Απού δυο μάτια στέκουν βλεπημένα και με έναν τέτοιον μόδον τα κυβεύγει, κι ότις για τσίνα να σκαλέψει χνάριν, βουργά τα μάτια κάμνουν τον λιθάριν.
A slightly altered form of this Cypriot love poem is contained in the third book of madrigals, composed by the Calabrian composer Giandomenico Martoretta. It is dedicated to the Cypriot noble Giovanni Synclitico, while the entire book of Martoretta's madrigals bears a dedication to Giovanni's brother, Pietro Synclitico. As inferred by this text, date June 30, 1554, Martoretta has met the nobleman Pietro Synclitico in Cyprus, while he was returning from a voyage to the Holy Land. Several other madrigals in the book are dedicated to by the composer to members of the Synclitico family. Giovanni and Pietro's cousin Eugenio, their brother Mutio, as well as Pietro's wife, Elena Synclitico the Nores. The Italian poem of the Nores mentions her marriage to Pietro Synclitico, which took place in Cyprus, indicating that it was likely written on the island. Other madrigals are dedicated to Pietro Synclitico's uncle, Tutio Costanzo, to Elena's cousin, Giacomo de Nores, to Eugenio Synclitico's cousin, Hector Podocatharo, son of Hercule Podocatharo, and Maria Costanzo, as well as to Gasparo Paglioli. Knowing Martoretta's acquaintances on the island, we are able to envisage the environment in which at least one of the Cypriot love poems was known and praised. As already mentioned, the poem appears in Martoretta's musical score in a slightly altered form. Professor Holton has shown that this version seems more authentic than the one in the Marciana manuscript. What does this imply? Could nobles who made this poem accessible to the composer have known it through a vivid tradition on the island? Or could one of them have written it? Would this individual have produced some other poems or even the entire collection as well? As has emerged from research conducted in recent years in archives and libraries in Venice and other cities in northern Italy, the Cypriot families mentioned were active not only in Cyprus, but also in Venice and its hinterland. They had close relationships with writers, academies, and intellectual circles of the time, had studied or even taught at Italian universities, possessed remarkable libraries with Greek, Latin, and Italian manuscripts and prints, and had developed a particular interest in both Neoplatonism and Petrarchan poetry. Interestingly enough, Eugenio Synclitico's house in the Venetian capital was adorned with a series of paintings inspired by Petrarch's triumphs. The triumphs of love, continence, time, divinity, fame, and death. They were created by Bonifacio de Pitati around 1545. The last two panels are no longer extant, but are known from 18th century copies. One of the paintings, the representation of the Triumph of Love, was used in the invitation to today's event as an indication of the environment in which the Cypriot love poetry could have been performed, read, or sung. Let us not forget that poetry and the visual arts had a close relationship throughout the Renaissance. The intellectual pursuits and tastes of the families with whom Martoretta came into contact in Cyprus and who were also active in the northern Italian context perfectly match the themes and style of these Cypriot love poems. I may add one more lead to the research of the circumstances of creation of the Cypriot love collection. Based on the composition dates of the Italian prototypes, Professor Vincenzo Pecoraro had argued that an initial core of the collection is directly related to Italian poetic production of the end of the 15th and early 16th centuries. This corresponds to an initial phase in the spread of Petrarchism through the courts of northern Italy, before its canonization through the editions of Pietro Bembus's and Jacopo Sanazzaro's Rime in the early 1530s. The Italian poems translated in the Cypriot collection were accessible in manuscript at the time, and only a few of them were later included in printed anthologies. The Cypriot love poems do not follow the poetic developments of the peak of the Petrarchan movement, as there are no translations of Italian poems from that specific phase, and they reconnect with the developments of Italian poetic writing in the mid-16th century, assimilating the first anti-Petrarchan tendencies. Such shift is evident in the Cypriot sonnet Pedagogos, a translation of the satirical sonnet Pedante by Camillo Scroffa with homoerotic content. The Italian prototype of Pedagogos dates back to around 1550. This is the latest example of Italian poetry leaving traces in the Cypriot collection. Considering the circumstances, we may argue that the successive stages of the approach, deviation, and reapproach of the Cypriot poetic collection with developments in the field of Italian Petrarchism could be attributed to external factors, such as the travels of the poet or poets between Cyprus and the Italian peninsula. From the poetic production accessible in Venice, or even some courts of the Italian north, at least one Cypriot poet drew inspiration in the late 15th or early 16th century. Returning to Cyprus, possibly with an Italian lyric poetry collection, and with his own poetic experiments, he shared with a literary circle on the island the new lyrical breath coming from the West, and blended it with elements of the local literary tradition. Several decades later, either he himself or some younger and less inspired poets associated with him by kinship or friendship returned to the Venetian metropolis. At that time, they reorganized the structure of the Cypriot collection and added their own translation attempts and original poems, sometimes anti-Petrarchan or even poetological in character, at the crossroads between late Renaissance and early Counter-Reformation in the tumultuous atmosphere of the Ottoman threat against their island. The choice of anonymity must have been made precisely during this period, as the Marciana manuscript got separated from the original manuscript in which it was part before passing to Natale Conti, who added his ownership note to the initial leaf of the collection. I'm working on shedding more light on this process of creation, which up to now can only be presented as a form of hypothesis. One thing is certain, though: the renowned Cypriot lyric collection we examine today represents a notable manifestation of the assimilation of Petrarchism in Cyprus and among Cypriots in the diaspora as well, who resided in Venice and its broader territory. The channels of communication between the island and the Venetian capital, and through it with the wider European sphere, remained strong throughout the period under examination. These channels underscore Cyprus's alignment with and contribution to the intellectual and cultural currents prevailing in northern Italy, and thus highlight the Iceland's European orientation during the early modern times. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rena, for this wonderful, wide-ranging, and very informative presentation that took us, even if for an hour, into the world of Renaissance Cyprus and the cultural exchanges that were happening at the time. I'm sure there will be questions and comments by the audience. So at this point, if you have any questions or comments that you would like to pose, you can do so either by typing it in the chat, or you can raise the virtual hand icon and I will give you the floor so that you can share your thoughts or questions with our speaker. And while you're preparing your questions or while you're typing, I may open this round of questions. I don't know if I could ask you, as I said also in my introduction, you are one of the pioneering scholars who are teaching us about the presence of Neoplatonism and its importance in this collection. So we know that there is a very strong tradition of love poetry in early modern Greek literature in general. And there have been many arguments that not just love poetry, but Petrarchan influenced love poetry, not just the Cypriot collection. So I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on whether this Neoplatonic character is unique to this collection from Greek literature, or is this something that we can find in other Greek literary works of the time?
I have already written an article regarding Neoplatonism on Eratokritos. Neoplatonic echoes on Eratokritos. And I am not the only one. There are several scholars who are working on this field. And I think that starting with Michalis Lasitiotakis, I think this is a field that that requires more research, and I have found the traces of Neoplatonism in several other works, masterpieces of the Cretan Renaissance as well. Generally, Petrarchan poetry is a way of transmission of Neoplatonic ideas into the text. But we have to keep in mind that Cretan Renaissance poetry was flourishing in a period in which Neoplatonism already faded. So whatever there is in the Cretan Renaissance works is an echo of an era which is which the writers leave behind. But the Cypriot poetry was written at the period in which Neoplatonism and Petrarchism were at their peak. So I think this is the most interesting field of the Cypriot lyric poetry from this point of view of the assimilation of Neo-Petrarchan and Neoplatonic notions.
Thank you so much, Irene. I see many comments and things that are arriving either in the public chat or privately. If you have any that you would like to share with the speaker, again, feel free to raise your hand and offer your comments. And I had another question, Rena. This is more like you've touched upon the nature of translation in the collections. And I wanted just to ask you to maybe share this with the audience as well. What is the approach to translation that we are talking about here? Is this a translation that reproduces basically the original? Is it a very creative approach to translation? Do we have many approaches that we can see in the collection? Because this is one of the most interesting features. I believe like half of the poems of the collection have been identified as translations, but what do we mean by translation?
Well, we mean different things. I mean, there are several ways of translation. Schiapcara Pizzilidis and later Giovanna Carbonaro have published the Italian prototypes of the Cypriot poems, and so we can make comparisons between them. And from the comparisons, it emerges that some poems are literary translations, something like 40 poems. I don't remember exactly the number. Most of the poems in the Cypriot collection that are connected with Italian ones bear only phrases or echoes of the Italian poems. And there are also Cypriot poems that are original, that they don't have any Italian prototypes. Since we are talking about Italian poetry in the period of Petrarchism, we have to bear in mind that the Italian poems look like a lot each other. I mean, even between the Italian poems, there are several motifs or themes or expressions that are common. So it is sometimes very difficult to identify the exact source of a Cypriot poem and to make the comparative analysis. Anyway, it has emerged from the recent research that the Cypriot poet or the Cypriot poets appropriate these Italian prototypes, making them match to their life. I mean, in one poem that Petrarch wrote, he says that I've been suffering for love the last 20 years, and the Cypriot poet changes the number of years in which he suffers. In other poems, the Cypriot poets add references to Christian, to the Christian thought. The tree which is in a den, for example, or they add elements from the local collection of the island. So it is, you have to go step by step and make the comparisons in order to be able to answer fully this question. I have a doctorate student. I think she's today with us, Lydia Kiskiliakova, who is preparing a PhD on this exact subject, the comparative analysis of Italian and Cypriot poems, and especially with emphasis on stylistic differences and the ideas also that these poems convey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rena. We have two questions that have come in the Q&A in the chat. So one is by Jim Biragos, who is asking whether the dialect of Cyprus is prevalent in most poetry of Cyprus, or whether the dialect of Cyprus is used in most of the literature of Cyprus at that time.
Yes, we certainly have a series of texts in Cypriot dialect, even before the period, even before the 16th century. It is a period in which, as Kehayoglu has shown in a recent book on the history of Cypriot literature, it is a period in which the dialect is elevated into a literary language, and the writers do this on purpose. It is probable that they imitate what the Italian poets did with the Toscan dialect, the dialect in which Petrarch and Dante wrote their masterpieces. The dialect that was this was the vernacular language of the time, and it was elevated to a poetic language and became a canon of the Petrarchan poetry due to Pietro Bembo, this famous Venetian scholar who has written a book exactly on the use of the vernacular language in poetry. So for the Italian poems, the vernacular was the Toscan dialect that became the basis for the standard Italic. For the Cypriots, it was the Cypriot dialect. And what is important is that this dialect that is used in this particular collection of poems is in a way purified. I mean, there are less Italian expressions than in other literary works of the time, or even than the language, the Cypriot dialect we find in the documents. This means that the poets wanted to use a constructed language for the poetry based on the dialect, but but extinguishing foreign words with foreign provenance. Excuse me for my English. I'm trying to make the best I can, but
it's perfectly clear and very, very illuminating. Thank you, Rena. There is a question in the chat from Thalia Chrysanthis who is saying, you discussed a bit about how the poems echo more ancient themes, referencing the myth of Apollo and Daphne. And I was wondering if ancient stories appear in these works in less subtle ways, so more openly. And if so, if that is coming from the Italian tradition or the Greek tradition.
yes, it is very good. This is a very good question. Several poems of this collection are based on ancient myths. Sometimes it is clear, the myth is clear, sometimes it's latent, but it is you can decipher to which myth the poet refers to. The interesting thing is that in most of the cases, these myths are present in the Italian prototypes. So the themes come back in the Greek territories through Italy. In Greek, we call it antidhanio, which is I don't know, counter borrowing or something, something which is Greek in origin, like the myths, the ancient Greek mythology, come in the forefront in the literary production in Cypriot dialect, but through the Italian poetry of Petrarchan fashion.
Very good. Thank you, Rena. I see that Alyosha Bilenberg has his hand up. Feel free to share your question.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the previous two questions, and the one about the dialect I also found illuminating. So for this poet writing in the vernacular, what was the other option? Maybe I might have missed it, but related to what you were just saying, it seems like there was both there was still in their minds a high Greek register that is like Attic, but they were also bilingual in Italian. Like, I'm confused a little bit about the Italian, Latin, Greek. So when you choose to write in the vernacular, what is it opposed to, and how does that work?
Yes, thank you for the question. It is a very interesting point. So in the island, vernacular Greek was an option. Cypriot dialect was another option. Vernacular Greek is not always the same as the Cypriot dialect, because when we say vernacular Greek, we mean a standard Greek, which is also spoken in other territories with Greek Orthodox populations outside Cyprus. And there was also a Greek spoken by the people who had studied ancient literature and had a Byzantine background. So this was an Atticizing Greek. So there were several levels of Greek language in the island. And then there was Latin, of course, which started as a language of communication, and it was also the language of the learned. There was Italian, vernacular, which was this common Italian based on the Tuscan dialect, as I was saying before. There was the Venetian language, which is not exactly the same as the vernacular Italian. There was also French, because before the Venetians, Cyprus was ruled by the French House of Lusignan. And there was also Arabic, of course. So in the island, there was a mixture of languages. And in the everyday life, all these different languages interfered with each other. So it is a very interesting field from the linguistic point of view. And the selections in the Cypriot Love Poetry Collection that point toward the Cypriot dialect, but without Italianisms, as much not all the Italianisms are of the collection, but most of them are. It is very indicative from this point of view.
Thank you. Could I just ask
Yes.
follow up? So in the Italian case, I don't know that much about the Italian case, but it seems like it was choosing the vernacular was opposed to writing poetry in Latin. For these collections, as far as we know, when they choose to write in Cypriot Greek, is it opposed to writing in the vernacular, the other vernacular Greek that you're saying, or to Latin or to Italian? Like, why would, basically I'm trying to ask, what does it mean that they're choosing to write in Cypriot Greek in this for this?
The languages are used in parallel ways. It is not that we finish with one language and we go on with the other. It depends on the writer and depends on the public that towards which this writer is directed. And it is interesting that all those nobles that were known to Martoretta in Cyprus, when he came, that Martoretta met when he went in Cyprus, they were very well accustomed with all these different linguistic traditions. They had books in their libraries that were Latin, Italian, Greek, of different levels. What is, I think, must be created in a language that is the language of everyday people, but elevated in a language that can express poetic notions. So it is a choice, as I said before, similar to the one that started from Petrarch and Dante, that was supported, sustained by Pietro Bembo. It is an orientation of the Italian intelligentsia of the time. And it seems that it is an experiment that the Cypriots chose also in their own field. That's how I understand it, but I may be wrong. I don't know.
Thank you, Rena. If we don't have any other questions, I was wondering if I can close with one final one. And I'm asking this because I've had the pleasure to talk with you privately about your research, Rena, and I know that you have many plans upcoming for this material and also for this circle of Cypriot nobles and intellectuals. Can you share some some information, some exclusive information about what are you planning to research next, or what kind of material do you want to see? Where is your research headed?
Yes, I was fortunate enough in the recent years to find a lot of unpublished information on on members of all the Cypriot families with which Martoretta came into contact. This information regards Cypriots in the court of Caterina Cornaro in the district of Azolo. I remind you that Caterina Cornaro was the queen of Cyprus, the one who gave Cyprus to Venice, and in exchange Venice has given to Caterina Cornaro possessions in the territory of Azolo, and there a cycle of people who were working on literary things was formed. And in this place, I have found some Cypriots from the families that Martoretta later met in Cyprus that could constitute a first nucleus of introduction of the Italian Petrarchan poetry to the Cypriot environment. A Cypriot environment of the diaspora, of course, not of the island itself. Then I have found several documents which regard private matters of these families in Venice, or their relation to the Venetian government, both in Cyprus and in Venice and its hinterland. These documents multiply when we arrive at the period just before the war in which Venice lost Cyprus. And after the war, there are a lot of documents that regard the assimilation of the Cypriots that came from the island to Venice. And I found that these noble families, the ones that Martoretta met in the island, played a very active role when the Cypriot refugees arrived in the Venetian metropolis in order to help them incorporate in the Venetian social fabric. And so I follow, with all the documentation I found, I follow the traces of these families through a long period of time, from the end of the 15th century to the mid of the 17th century. I'm preparing a book on these families, trying to underline all the material that is that can be linked with the Cypriot lyrical poems we have examined today. And I have found also some other interesting material information regarding Natale Conti, who was the owner of the manuscript in which the poems survive today. I have found several documents regarding his life and his family's life, and his writings, both in Latin, Italian, and atticized in Greek, and his connections with Cyprus. Because at the end I was trying to understand why this poetry collection that written in the Cypriot language dialect was interesting for an Italian scholar who didn't speak in the Cypriot dialect. And well, I think I have some hypotheses on this, and I'm going to present them in a congress that will be held at Rome at the end of October. dedicated on the literature of Cyprus. And I'm preparing a chapter of my book, especially regarding Martoretta. And then I am trying to reconstruct also the poetry that was written, to present more material on the poetry that was written and read in Cyprus during the Renaissance, because I have found Italian poems written in Cyprus of Petrarchan fashion as well. And the cycle from which these Italian poems were produced is very close to the cycle in which the manuscript of the Marciana manuscript was produced. So I'm trying to understand the links between the Italians who engaged themselves with poetry in Cyprus and this particular love poetry collection. These are only some of the traces that I'm following in order to write my book. I hope that during 1 year from now, I will be able to present this book of mine. And thank you very much for letting me express this journey I'm following.
Thank you so much, Rena. You said it just some aspects, but to say that it's exciting and that we are eagerly awaiting them is an understatement. So we very much look forward to them. There is a question if there are any musical plans. This is not about you, Rena, I believe, but in general about if there are any musical plans about the rhymes of love and Alkinos Ioannidis. Not to the best of our knowledge, but I should say that there have been many fine renditions of selected poems into music. We can share any info if anybody wants links for some nice listening this weekend. We'll be happy to share. So at this point, I believe we can close the Q&A by thanking once again our speaker for this incredible, stimulating, very informative lecture, for the generosity with which she shared her expertise. We would like to thank Alkinos Ioannidis and the recording crew that made this possible, and the Axiothea Center in Nicosia that provided the spaces, and of course all our partners. Ioanna Kakouli, our acting director, mentioned them. I should say that to have so many partners, not just from Cyprus and Greece and embassies and consulates, but also from other cultural and literary departments at the university, speaks volumes to the importance that this topic has for everyone. For those of you who are in the area and you want to have some more Alkinos tasting events, I'm adding a link on our chat, because we have Alkinos in about 2 weeks here for a lecture on the art of singing and a solo concert. So if you're in the area and you are looking for a great cultural engagement with Cyprus and Alkinos' voice in particular, we will be very happy to welcome you. So thank you again to the speaker, to those who contributed, and also to you, the audience, who were with us here today. I hope you enjoyed it, and we hope that we will welcome you to many future events. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.